Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating the world system. Now, before we hop into Roblox Studio, we're going to want to go ahead and go down below in the description to a link to this Patreon post right here, which includes a bunch of free model assets that you guys can use and that we've been using while we've been working on this series. I added one new model to this pack, which is actually the world portal, and we'll be importing that into our game today. So now, once you've downloaded that from the Patreon for completely free, there's going to be a bunch of different models inside of there that you can import into Roblox Studio. And today, we're going to be using the model called World Portal. And of course, to import this, we're going to go ahead and right-click somewhere inside of the Explorer, click on Insert from File, and then we're going to select the Portal World file, and then go ahead and click Open. Now, once we click Open, we can see that this model has been imported directly inside of our studio. And now, to make this portal fit a little bit better in our world, all I did was sort of take one of these outer mountains, make it a little bit larger, and reposition it a tiny bit to kind of complement the portal that we have positioned right there. In addition to that, I'm going to go ahead and delete this tree just because it makes it look a little bit better. As I always say, this series is not really to show you how to build a nice looking game. It's mostly just to cover all of the aspects of development and not go too much into stuff like modeling, GUIs, or things like that, and a lot more into the scripting side of things. Now, we should actually look a little bit into the world portal model that we just imported into our game to see exactly how this is set up. Pretty much the most important thing about it is that we have a part inside of the world portal called button. Now, if we select the world portal model, we can actually see that the button is the primary part of this model. And all this part is it's a simple little square part that normally is completely transparent, so players can't actually see it. It's not collidable either, so players can just walk right through it and will never actually notice that it's there. But the reason that we have this part here is because we're actually going to use it to display our proximity prompt to the player when they get near this portal. So whenever the player walks up to this portal, we're going to position the proximity prompt on this button part right here. So the player will see that proximity prompt, it'll tell the player hold E to teleport to the different world, and that's how the player is going to be able to actually use the portal to travel to another world. So with that being said, that's pretty much the most unique thing that we really need to understand about how this specific model is set up. Now, one more really important thing that we need to do before we can get further into this is actually go to the Workspace service inside of our Explorer and scroll all the way down towards the bottom of its properties. Towards the bottom of its properties, we should see a property called Streaming Enabled. And currently, I have this disabled, and I would recommend that you do the same. Otherwise, you are very likely to start running into issues if you haven't already. Now, while I think Streaming Enabled is a very useful feature, and I certainly will develop my games around that in our future series, this clicking simulator series was started before Roblox made the Streaming Enabled property enabled by default. So if you follow this series all the way from the very beginning, there's a good chance that you already have the Streaming Enabled property disabled, just like I do. But if you started to follow the series a few months after we created it, then when you created your game, the Streaming Enabled property was enabled by default more than likely. And over time, as my videos have gone older and older, I've seen a lot of people reporting a ton of issues because our systems were not developed with streaming in mind because it originally was disabled by default. Just to reiterate though, I think Streaming Enabled is a very useful feature, and in our future series, I plan on writing all of our systems to be compatible with Streaming Enabled. But considering the series is meant to be easy and to be learned from, I don't think going back through all of our old systems, which would be broken by this setting, changing all of them around, and then developing our future systems around this option would be the best solution. With that solution, I think there's a lot of room for error when somebody is following the tutorial, and it could just cause them an even bigger headache when the simple alternative is just to disable this property inside of our Workspace service. So that's why I'm choosing the one-click solution here. And again, in future series, we will develop around Streaming Enabled. Cool, so now that we've disabled that property, the next thing that we're going to do is create a folder inside of our Workspace. And we're going to rename this to be called World Portals. So now that we've created that folder, we're going to go ahead and drag our world portal model inside of that folder. And we're actually going to rename this model to be called the world that we want the player to teleport to when they use this portal. So our second world is going to be called Atlantis. And so that's what I've renamed this model to. Now that we've done that, we also need to clean up a couple of other things that are inside of our workspace as well. So if we look, we have our spawn location. We also have a couple of egg stands and the pet index model as well. And we're going to drag all of these things inside of our spawn folder. Now that we've thrown all those things inside of the spawn folder, the next thing I'll do is create another folder, and we're going to rename this to be called Worlds. Then what I'll do is drag the spawn folder inside of the worlds folder, and this is how we're going to be organizing each individual world. Oh, one more thing I forgot to throw into the spawn folder is the jumps folder, so let's put that inside of there as well. And now inside of our workspace, we should just have the island folder, the worlds folder, the world portals folder, and the portals folder as well. So now, in order to create our second world, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the world folder, and we're going to go ahead and duplicate the spawn folder. Now, I'm going to quickly rotate this by hitting Control R 2 times, and that basically rotates rotates it in 180 degrees. I'll then drag this out a little bit, and then I'm going to rename this folder to be called Atlantis. Now, there's a few changes that we need to make inside of here, so let's go a little bit closer to our second world build. And inside of our Atlantis folder, what we want to do is we want to actually delete the spawn location right here. Then inside of here, we can go ahead and create a part. Now, rather than using a spawn location, we're actually going to use a part, and we're going to use this part as the location for where we want to teleport the player to whenever they use the portal to teleport into this world. So I'm going to actually rename this part to be called spawn. We want to make sure that we anchor this part and set can collide to false so the players cannot touch it. They'll just pass right through it. We also want to set the transparency of it to 1 as well. And I'd recommend only changing the transparency after you know that you have positioned it nicely, which that looks pretty good to me. Awesome. So now that we set the spawn location up inside of our second world, we're also going to set the islands up inside of here as well. So we're actually going to go inside of the islands folder and we're going to duplicate all 3 of our currently existing islands. And then we're going to move them above our second world, and I'll also rotate them as well. So now that we have these islands positioned above our second world, what we're going to do is start to rename the different folders. So of course, the first island is called Forest, but in our second world, the first island is actually going to be called Moon. So we have the Moon Island, then we'll select our Arctic Island, which is going to be the second island in the second world, and we're going to call this Mars. Then we have the Volcano folder, which is the third island in our second world, and this last island is going to be called Sun. Now, I know you're probably thinking, why are you naming the islands inside of your Atlantis world based on sort of a space theme? And well, I don't know, I'm not too creative, and I just really couldn't think of any good aquatic names to sort of name the islands, so I guess I just went with the Moon, which seemed a lot more intuitive to me. But anyway, to look back at all 3 of these islands inside of our second world, our first island is the Moon Island, our second island is the Mars Island, and then our third island is the Sun Island. So now that we have all those islands set up, we have to do the same thing for our portals. So let's go ahead and duplicate those models, drag them over a little bit, rotate them, continue to move them over, and now we kind of have them in the right location. Let's just reposition them a little bit more, and I think that is pretty good. So again, with these portals, we also have to rename as well. So we're going to rename the Forest portal to Moon, we'll rename the Arctic portal to Mars, and then finally we'll rename the Volcano portal to Sun. Cool, so now we're good for the islands and the portals. Now, the next thing that we actually want to do is to create sort of a hitbox which we can use to determine what island the player is currently on. And now you might be wondering, why would we have to track what world the player is inside of? Well, we would need to track this because each world has a specific clicker boost that's given to the player whenever they are inside of that world. So how we're going to do this is by going inside of the worlds folder, inside of the Atlantis folder, and then we're going to go ahead and add a brand new part inside of here. Now, we're going to rename this part to be called Hitbox. We're going to want to set it to be anchored. We want to set can collide to false, but we do want to make sure that can true is enabled, which it is enabled by default. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and resize it. So I'm going to make sure that it's even a little bit bigger or the exact same width and length of the entire world itself. And sorry, you might hear me using the word island instead of world when I should be using the opposite word. I'm just very used to saying island for some reason, and I feel like I'm catching myself saying island when I should be saying world. Anyway, with all that being said, now that we've set this to be the same width and length of the world, I'm going to go ahead and start to adjust its height. Cool. And now that we've adjusted that, we can see some changes that we need to make to fit everything inside of here. And we can rotate around this hitbox a little bit to see if anything's missing or sticking out, which nothing seems to be. So that's all good to go. Now let's say that your island stretch really, really high. And I'm talking even higher than the size of a single part could go. And keep in mind that the largest a part can be is 2048 in every single direction. And if that happens, all you have to do is simply just duplicate the hitbox and we can use multiple hitboxes. Just make sure that the part is still named hitbox, and then you could just reposition it a little bit above where our previous hitbox was at as well. But since our islands don't stretch that high, I don't actually need to do that. So anyways, now that we know that this hitbox is all good to go, I'm going to go ahead and set the transparency to 1. Now, one of the final things that we need to do inside of the workspace is go inside of our World Portals folder, and we're going to duplicate the Atlantis model. We'll then rotate this 180 degrees, and then we're going to drag it over to the Atlantis island. We'll then reposition it to look nicely over here, and then I'm going to rename this model to be called Spawn. Now, the reason that we're renaming this to be Spawn is because when the player is on the Atlantis island, we want to allow them to use this portal to go back to our Spawn island, which is right over here. So when the player is in the first world, they'll go ahead and use this portal to travel over to Atlantis, which is our second world. And when they're in the second world, they're going to go ahead and use this portal to travel back to the Spawn world, which of course is our first world. And now that we've done that, we're pretty much done with working inside of the workspace. Now, before we can get into scripting, we still have one last thing to do, and that's actually create the World Boost GUI, which luckily for us is extremely simple. So inside of the Star GUI, we're going to create a brand new screen GUI. We're going to rename this to be called World, and we actually want to set the Ignore GUI Inset property to true, and we're going to set the Reset On Spawn property to false. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a text label. We'll rename this to be called Title. For the text of this, we're going to use a map emoji. We'll then say space World Boost, colon, and then we'll say something like 100%, and then we'll use another map emoji. Now, if you don't know how to use map emojis, if you're on Windows 10, just like I am, you can use the Windows plus the period key, and that should pop this GUI open for you. If not, just go into Google and search up emoji keyboard or something like that, and then you can type in the name of the emoji on the website, and then you should just be able to copy and paste that emoji directly inside of here as well. Anyways, now that we've modified the text, let's set text scale to true. We're going to set the text color to white. We'll set the background transparency to 1. We'll then adjust the font. Of course, we'll go with a Gotham, and we'll make that bold. We'll then make sure that the size is set to scale, so 0.1.1. Then we'll make this a little bit larger. For the size, I'm going to go with 0.275 on the X and 0.075 on the Y. Let's then make sure that we center this horizontally, so 0.5 on the X and 0.5 on the X. And then we just want to position this towards the top of our screen. So on the Y, we'll set that to about 0.015, and I think that looks pretty good. And now that's actually all that we have to do for the GUI. So we can go ahead and collapse all of that. So now that we've done all of that, we can finally get around to scripting. Now, to begin scripting, the first thing that we're going to do is create the world's config module. So inside of the replicated storage, we have the configs folder, and inside of here, we're going to add a brand new module script. Of course, we'll go ahead and rename this to be called worlds, and we also want to update the module variable as well, so we'll go ahead and rename that. Now, inside of here, we actually want to get the islands config as well, so let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Now, how we would normally require module variables, or most things in general, is by actually creating a variable for the replicated storage, then indexing that with the configs folder, and then indexing that with the actual module itself. That way is perfectly fine, and the one that I generally show off the most to people. But another perfectly safe method that I've also been recommended to use is by doing something like, say, script.parent, and remember, these are both located inside of the same folder, which is called configs, and now all we have to say is islands to get the islands config module. Now, I want to recommend this method if you're trying to access something, say, from a different service or directory. Instead, I'd probably recommend just to create a variable for that service and then use that variable and index through there to get whatever module or thing that you actually need. But since these things are both, 1, located inside of the replicated storage, and 2, located inside of the exact same folder, this is a perfectly fine method to require this as well, and I figured it was worth showing to you guys as well as just an alternative method to do the same thing that we've done 100 times the exact same way. Anyways, now that we've done that, we're going to set this up very similar to how we have our islands config set up as well. So the first variable inside of here is going to be called world order, and this is going to be a table which contains some strings, and those strings are going to be the name of our worlds. So our first world is going to be spawn, and the second world is going to be Atlantis. And of course, the order that we put these strings in actually matters here. So spawn will be our first world, while Atlantis will be the second world. Then for our second variable, that's going to be called config, which again is going to be a table. And inside of this table, we're going to be using the world name as the key. So we'll say spawn, and then for the value, we'll be having a table which has a couple of properties inside of it. So for instance, the only property that we're going to add to this table is actually called boost, which for the spawn island is going to be set to 0 because we don't want the spawn island to actually give the player any clicks. We want them to work up to the second world and then get the boost from that one. Again, I feel like I'm still constantly catching myself using island instead of world. I'm sorry that I'm mixing these words up so much, and I hope that I'm not causing you too much confusion. Just please keep that in your mind that sometimes I am legitimately using those words incorrectly, and I'm not trying to, but I'm also not able to catch myself every single time I do it as well. So I'm very sorry for that. Anyways, expanding the config table, the second world, of course, is going to be called Atlantis, which again is going to be equal to a table. Our first property is going to be called boost, and we're going to set that to 1. And by 1, we effectively mean increasing their click boost by 100%. And now this is actually going to have a second property, which is going to be called required island. And that's going to be set to a string. And now we actually want to use the island name that the player must unlock before they can travel to the new world. And generally, we would set the required island to be the last island that they can unlock inside of the previous world. Now remember, inside of our spawn world, we have the forest, the Arctic, and the volcano island, with the volcano island being the last island that the player can unlock. So we're going to set the required island of the Atlantis world to be volcano, so that the player has to unlock the volcano island inside of the spawn world before they can travel to the Atlantis world. And that's all that we have to do for that config variable, and now we're going to start creating some functions. The first function that we're going to create is a shared function, which is going to be called does player own requirement. This is going to accept the player's data as well as the world that we want to check the requirement of and see if the player owns that requirement. So inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called required island. That's going to be equal to worlds.config. We'll index the config with the specific world, and then of that world, we're going to go ahead and check for its required island property. Now, if the island does have a required island property, then we're going to check if the player has that island unlocked. And in order to do this, we're going to go ahead and return the result of a function that's stored inside of the island's config module. So we're going to say island config.isIslandUnlocked. we'll pass through the player's data, and we'll also pass through the required island as well. Now, after that if statement, the last thing that we want to do in this function is return true. And the only way that we'll actually reach this return statement is if there is no required island. So if there is no required island, then when this function is called, it was most likely called with spawn being the world. And of course, every player has the spawn island unlocked, so that's why we're going to return true right here. Now, after that, we're going to go ahead and create another function. This is going to be called getWorldSpawnPart, which again is going to accept the world as a string. And now the reason that we need to create this function is because remember, our spawn island actually has a spawn location inside of it called spawn location. Whereas with our second world, we removed the spawn location and instead added a basic part, which is called spawn, and that's what we're going to use as the position for where to teleport the player to when they travel to that world. So since our spawn location can vary from world to world, where realistically it would be different from one world to every single other world, we're going to create a single function which can easily handle and work with the different types of spawn locations. So inside of here, we're going to create a variable called worldPart. And what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the workspace service. Now, realistically, I need to create a variable for the workspace service because I don't know why, I just never like to use that lowercase version of the workspace service. So we're just going to go ahead and use our workspace service variable. Now, inside of the workspace service, we have a folder called worlds. We're going to index that with the specific world. And then inside of that world folder, we're going to use the findFirstChild method to look inside of that folder for a part called spawn. Now, if that part doesn't actually exist, then we're going to kind of do the same thing. And the only difference here is that we're instead going to look for a part called spawn location instead of looking for a part called spawn. So now once we found one of those two parts, what we're then going to do is go ahead and return our world part variable. Now, realistically, we don't even have to make that into a variable. We could just say return and then just do it like this. But I don't mind creating a variable and then just returning that variable. I think that's a little bit neater, but hey, you could always choose to do whichever one you want to. And now that we have that function created, we're going to create one last one, which is going to be called getWorldBoost. And of course, this is going to accept the string of the world. And all we're going to do with this function is simply return the boost property of that specific world. So we're going to say return worlds.config, index that with a specific world, and then get the boost property from that world. Awesome. So now that we've created all those functions and all those variables, we're actually done with the world's config. So we can go ahead and close out of that. Now, the next thing we're going to do is actually update another config, which is the islands config, to add in our brand new islands. So we're going to go ahead and open up the islands module. Inside of here, we can see that we have our island order table, and we're going to add all of our new islands to this. Now we're actually going to go ahead and start off with the Atlantis island. While this is a world, we also include our spawn world inside of the island order as well. So that's why we're including the Atlantis island / world inside of here as well. Then our first island of the Atlantis world is Moon. We then have Mars, and then finally we have the Sun. So now that we've added all those to the island order variable, we also want to add these to the config variable as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and actually copy and paste all three of these. And now we'll go ahead and start renaming them. So we'll start off with Moon. The price of this is going to be 50,000, and we're going to require them to have the volcano island unlocked because we do want to require them to have the volcano unlocked before they can unlock this island. After Moon, we then have Mars, which is going to cost 100,000. And of course, we want them to have unlocked the Moon island. Then finally, we have the Sun island. And of course, we want the player to have unlocked the Mars island before they can unlock the Sun island. And the Sun island is going to cost 1 million clicks. Cool. So now that we've added all of our new islands to our island config module, we're actually done inside of here as well. So now that we've updated both those configs, the next thing that I want to do is go ahead and update the player's data. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template. Inside of here, we're going to go all the way down to the very bottom inside of our template variable. And beneath our offline key, we're going to add another key, which is going to be called current world. And this is going to be set to a string called spawn. Now, ultimately, adding this current world key to the player's data here is not really necessary. And what I mean by that is there are different ways that we could handle this data because we don't actually need the current world that the player was in to be persistent or saved whenever they leave the game. Of course, this could be useful if you wanted to teleport the player back to the world that they were in whenever they left, but that's not what we're going to do. We're always going to teleport them back to the spawn world whenever they rejoin our game. So since we're not using the data of when the player logs out and then when the player logs back in, this doesn't need to be persistent, and we don't actually need this inside of here. But rather than storing this data entirely separately, which we just haven't done and we're not used to, we can store this data inside of the player's data like we normally would and have been doing for this entire series without really having any downsides at all. Anyways, that's all we have to add to the player's data so we can get out of the template. And now we're going to be getting a little bit ahead here, but if you guys have made it this far into the series, what are we at? Literally episode 60? You can probably assume and understand at this point how the replication system has worked this entire time with player data. Of course, whenever we add new player data to their template, template, generally we're going to modify that on the server side and then have to use a remote event to replicate that to the client side, the changes that we've made. And now normally I implement that networking after we've created the script which would modify that data on the server side, but I'm going to preemptively do that here. So inside of the replicated storage, we have the remotes folder. I'm going to add a brand new remote event to this, and we're going to rename this remote event to be called update current world. And now that we've created that remote event, let's go ahead and update the client state manager. So we'll go ahead and open up that module script, go all the way down towards the bottom. We'll just go ahead and copy and paste one of these. Of course, we want to listen to the update current world remote event. And now look, I'm going to give you one wild guess. What data do you think this remote event is going to pass from the server down to the client? Well, did you guess right? Of course, that is going to be the new world that the player has now entered. Anyways, once we get that data, what do we want to do? Well, inside of the player data, they have the current world string, and we're going to set that to the brand new world that the player is now inside of. And that's all that we have to do for the client state manager. So we can go ahead and close out of that as well. Now, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and start implementing this on the server side. In order to do this, we're going to go inside of the server script service and create a brand new script. Of course, we'll rename the script to be called worlds. And inside of here, we're going to need to get a couple of services. So go ahead and create all of those variables. Along with those services, we're going to need to create a couple of variables for some modules as well. So we're going to need the player data manager as well as the world's config module. And finally, one of the last variables that we're going to need to create is one for our remotes folder stored inside of the replicated storage. Cool. So now that we've created all those variables, one of the first things that we need to do is set up the hitbox that we added to our world. Now remember, these hitboxes are going to be used to determine what world the player is currently inside of. And one of our worlds, like the spawn world, does not have any hitboxes because by default, we're going to be saying that the player is inside of the spawn world. So let's go ahead and create a function called setUpWorldHitboxes. And that's not going to have any parameters. Now, what we're going to do is loop through all the children inside of the worlds folder. So we're going to say for_world in workspace.worlds get children do. So this loop is going to iterate through everything that we have stored inside of the worlds folder. So each world is going to be a folder which contains all of the contents of whatever is stored inside of that world. So then what we're going to do is create another loop, and this time we're going to loop through all the children inside of the world folder. So again, we're going to say for_, and this time we'll say children in world get children do. And this is where we can actually find that hitbox part stored at. So now, as we're looping through each of the children, what we want to do is find that hitbox. And how do we find that hitbox? Well, we can determine if we found a hitbox by checking its name. If the child is named hitbox, then we know that we got the part that we're looking for. We could even add another more specific check to this, even though we probably don't really need to. But if the child is named hitbox and the child is a part, then we know that we definitely got what we're looking for. So now once we get the hitbox part, what we're going to do is listen for the touched event on that part, and we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. Now, with this anonymous function, we're actually not going to do anything inside of here. And I know that it sounds really weird, but the only reason that we're actually creating this connection is because we're actually going to use a method called getTouchingParts. And now this method can be used on any part. So let's just say, for instance, because we know this child is a part, we're going to use the getTouchingPart method. And now we can see a brief description of what this method is used for. And this method returns a table of all basePart.canCollideTrue parts that intersect with this part. Now we're going to be using this method on the player's humanoid root part. So when we use this method on the player's humanoid root part, we're basically going to check all the parts which are currently touching the player's character. Now I think naturally most people would assume that you can just use getTouchingParts, and this would return every single part, even if that part is not collidable or it's fully transparent so you can't see, and other things like that. But that's actually not true. This method will generally only give us other parts that are intersecting with that part if they have the canCollide property set to true. Now, because we don't want our hitbox to collide with the player, and we want the player to not even be able to tell that there is a hitbox there, we need to connect to the touched event on the hitbox part in order for when we use the getTouchingParts method to actually be able to pick up our hitbox part, because we made our hitbox not collidable. So since all of our hitbox parts are not collidable, we need to connect to the touched event. Otherwise, when we use the getTouchingParts method, it literally will just not pick up the hitbox part, even though the player is standing directly inside of it. So honestly, I'd recommend just leaving a comment inside of here so that you don't come back to this later and be like, why would I have set this connection up? Clearly I did that by mistake and just forgot to delete it. No, it was not a mistake. You absolutely need it. So my comment just says, need to do this because it's a non-collidable part. Anyways, now that we've done all of that, we're done with creating that function. So directly below where we create it, we can actually go ahead and just call it because we want to run that as soon as our game starts up. Now, we'll go ahead and create another function, which is going to be called getPlayersInWorlds. Inside of here, we're going to create a table called PlayersInWorlds. And now what we're going to do is iterate through every single player that is currently inside of our game. From there, we want to go ahead and get the character of each player. So we're going to say character equals player dot character. If we're unable to get the player's character, then we want to skip over that player and go to the next one. If we are able to get their character, then we're going to go ahead and get their humanoid root part, which is going to be equal to character, find first child, and we want to look for a child inside of the character named humanoid root part. Now again, if we're not able to find that part, then we're going to go ahead and continue with the iteration. But if we are able to find that part, then we're going to go ahead and create a variable called touching parts and get all the parts which are currently touching that part of their character. So we're going to say humanoid root part, get touching parts, and that'll return us an array with all of the parts that are currently touching the humanoid root part. So now once we get all of those parts, what do we want to do? Well, we want to check if any of those parts are the hitbox, and then from the hitbox, we can determine what island the player is currently on. So let's go ahead and loop through all those parts that the player is currently touching. We're going to say for underscore comma part in touching parts do. Now remember, this is an array of parts. It's not an array of strings or anything like that. So we need to check the name property of that part and check if that part is named hitbox. Now actually, even before we get the touching parts, let's go ahead and create a variable called world, and by default, we're going to set that to spawn. Then going back inside of our for loop, if we do find a part that is named hitbox, what we want to do is get the world from that hitbox. Now we'll go ahead and create a variable called world name. And how we would normally get the world name from the hitbox part is by using the hitbox part, but then going up to its parent and then using the name of its parent. So remember, the hitbox part is stored inside of a folder, and then that folder is stored inside of the worlds folder. And that folder is named either Spawn or Atlantis in our example. So that's how we're actually able to get the world name from the hitbox part. But one instance that we need to think of is that we actually use the hitbox part in other aspects of our game. So for instance, when players try to redeem their daily reward chest, we also use a hitbox part for that as well. And we use that for unlocking islands as well. So there's multiple different systems in our game which require parts to be called hitbox. That's why we have to do some verification here to confirm this is the hitbox that we're actually looking for. Now, I would say the easiest way to check this is by using the worlds config. So we're going to say if worlds config, and then we'll use our config variable that we created, and we'll index that with our current world name. Now this if statement will require the world name to be either Atlantis or Spawn, because those are the only keys that we use inside of our config currently. If the world name is not either of those two, then indexing config with that name, the value would be nil because it doesn't exist in that table. So this if statement will not run if the world name is not found as a key inside of our config. So now that we've determined that we actually did get a real world, what we're going to do is update the world variable and set that equal to the world name. And then we'll also use break as well to stop iterating through all the touched parts because we've now already determined what world the player is currently inside of. So now that we've determined what world the player is inside of, let's go ahead and add them to the players in worlds table. So we'll go ahead and index that table with the player's user ID as our key. And for a value, we'll go ahead and set that to the world that the player is currently inside of. And of course, we're going to do this for every single player. And once we've done that for every single player, we're going to go ahead and return our players in worlds variable. Cool. So now that we've created that function, let's go ahead and use it. At the bottom of the script, we're going to say task.spawn and create an anonymous function. Inside of this anonymous function, we're actually going to use a while true loop, and we're going to run this loop every 5 seconds. Now, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called players in worlds. And of course, we're going to set that equal to our get players in worlds function. So once we create that variable, we then know all the players and what world they're currently inside of. We'll then go ahead and loop through all the players once again. And now we want to go ahead and get their profile. So we're going to say player data.profiles and index that with the player. If we're unable to get their profile, then just continue going through the loop. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable called world, and that's going to be equal to the players in worlds variable. Index that with the player's user ID. And now if this returns nil for some reason, because like maybe we couldn't find their character or some other reason, then of course the default world that we want to set them to is spawn. And now that we've done that, we also want to make sure that they own the requirement of the world that they're currently in. Imagine an exploiter got into our game and just teleported to a different world that they don't even have access to yet. We wouldn't want to give them any boosts that are applied from that world because they have not actually unlocked that yet. So we're going to create a variable called doesPlayerOwnRequirement, and we're going to use a function that we created earlier inside of our worlds config. So we're going to say worlds config that does player owned requirement. We'll pass through the player's profile data as well as the specific world. Now, if the player does not own the requirement, then all we're actually going to do is go ahead and set the world back to spawn. Then after we've done that, we've actually now determined what world the player is currently inside of. So we're going to go ahead and update their player data and replicate that to the client. So we're going to say profile.data.currentWorld, and we're going to set that equal to the world, and then we'll use the update current world remote event that we created earlier. So we'll say fire client, and we'll also pass through the world as well. Awesome. And now that we've done that, we are pretty much done with this, but I'm going to do one last thing. And inside of this while loop, I'm going to cut out almost all of the code except for the task.wait. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the pcall function. And now once I create that pcall, I'm going to go ahead and paste the code back inside of here. Now, the reason that I'm wrapping all this code inside of this pcall is because we're using a while loop, which is meant to run during our entire game. And now if any error was thrown inside of this while loop, that would actually break the entire while loop, and this whole feature would be non-functional in that server until the game has restarted. Now, based on how we set up our system, I don't think that there should be any errors ever caused inside of here. But now, if we wrap all of that code inside of a pcall, if any of this code throws an error, the pcall will basically catch that and prevent the while loop from breaking and not working until the game has restarted. Now again, like I said, I don't think the pcall is necessary, but it's definitely better to be safe than sorry. Anyways, now that we've created all that, we're actually done with scripting this on the server side. So we can go ahead and close out of that script. And now we can begin scripting this on the client side. Now the first thing that we're going to do on the client side is actually update a script that we've created previously. Because of some of the changes that we have some of our islands and worlds organized, we now have to update this script to make it function as normal once again. So the script that we're going to be updating is inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, and it's actually called portals. Inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the worlds config. So let's go ahead and add that here. Cool. Now that we have that variable created, we're going to go pretty much towards the very bottom of the script, and we want to go inside of the register return portal touch function. Now, this function is used whenever a player touches a portal on an island, and that'll teleport them back to, say, the spawn island / world or the Atlantis world. So from one of the further islands back to the main island, basically. And now how this function previously worked, or currently does work, is we set the spawn part equal to the spawn location, which was stored inside of the workspace. Now, since we no longer store the spawn location inside of the workspace, we have to change this up a little bit. What we're going to do is actually remove that variable entirely, and then after we check if the player exists, we're going to go ahead and create another variable, which is going to be called return part. And to get the return part, we're actually going to use a function that we created inside of our worlds config earlier. So we're going to say worlds config.get world spawn part. And now we need to pass the current world that the player is in to this function. Now I'm going to go ahead and actually create a variable for the world that the player is currently in. And how do we get that world that the player is currently in? Well, we use the state manager. So we say state manager.getData and then .current world. So now that we have the world that the player is currently in, we go ahead and pass it to that function. And then once we are given that return part, we go ahead and pivot the player's character to that return part C-frame. And that's actually all the changes that we had to make inside of here. So now this will work with all the changes that we have made and work for all the new islands as well as the new worlds. Now, the next thing that we're going to script on the client side is actually the GUI that we created a little bit earlier. So we're going to go inside of the star player, inside of the star player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and we're actually going to create a new folder inside of here, and we're going to rename this to be called Worlds. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a module script. We'll then go ahead and rename this to be called World Boost, and we'll update the module variable as well. Now, of course, inside of here, we're going to need to create a couple of variables. So we have our standard service variables. We also have a variable for the player and the player GUI. We also have the remotes variable. Then we get our worlds config as well as the state manager. We then have a variable for our GUI. And remember, the screen GUI that we created earlier is called world. Inside of the GUI, we have a text label called title, so we created a variable for that as well. Now, inside of this module, we're going to go ahead and create one shared function. So we'll say world boost, and this function is going to be called update world, and it's going to have one parameter, which is going to be world, and that's going to be a string, and it's going to be optional as well. Now, inside of this function, we're going to create a variable for the current world that the player is inside of, and we're going to set this variable to either the world which was passed to this function, or if no world was passed to this function, then we're going to go ahead and use the current world, which is stored inside of the player's data. Now that we've gotten the world that the player is currently inside of, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called boost and get the boost that the world offers. And remember, we created a function inside of the world's config earlier that we can use to do this. So we're going to say world's config.get world boost. We'll pass through the current world, and then we'll multiply that number by 100. Because remember, the boost property that we set inside of the world config is numbers like 0, 1, or even say 2, for example. Now, when we use those numbers, we actually mean that the boost is 100% of the player's current clicks, or 200% of the player's current clicks. And of course, you can handle this differently if you want to, but when we visually display this boost to the player, we want to say 100% instead of just 1 or 1%, for example. And now that we've actually gotten the boost, we're going to go ahead and update the text of the title text label. And again, we're going to use that map emoji. We'll then say world boost : then we'll display the boost, and then we'll put a percent symbol after that, and then another map emoji. And that's all that we actually have to do for that function. Now, another thing that we want to do inside of here is we want to listen for that update current world remote event to be fired, and then we're going to call the function that we just created. So we're going to say remotes.update current world on client event : connect. We'll create an anonymous function inside of here, and then we're going to say task.delay. we'll wait 0 seconds, and then we'll call the update world function that we just created. As usual, we're using task.delay to wait 0 seconds because we're waiting for the state manager to get updated first before we actually call this function. Alternatively, we could actually put world as the parameter and then simply just call update world with that specific world, but that's like 5 extra words in our code that we need to type out, and we've been doing this way for a long time, so that's why I'm continuing to go with this way as well. Anyways, now that we've done that, we're actually done with this script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. The next thing that we're going to do is actually script the world portals, such as creating a proximity prompt that will be displayed to the player and they can use to activate the portal and teleport to the next world. So again, inside of the worlds folder, this time we're going to go ahead and create a local script, and we're going to rename this to be called portals. Now, of course, inside of here, we're going to need to get some of our variables. So we're going to need all of our usual services. We then also want to get the world's config, our notifications module, as well as the state manager. In addition to that, we're going to want to require the world boost module that we just created. So we'll say script.parent.worldBoost, and then we're going to want to create a variable for our local player. So we're going to say players.localPlayer. Now, to get started, the first thing that we're going to do is create a function called teleport to world. This, of course, is going to accept a world as its only parameter. Now, inside of here, we want to create a variable for the player's character. So we're going to say player.character. If we're unable to find that character, then we're going to go ahead and return and stop the function right there. Next, we'll create a variable called world part. And remember, we actually just kind of did the same exact thing in our other portal script. So how do we get the world part? Well, we say world's config dot get world spawn part, and then we pass to the world. Now, once we get that world part, what we're going to do is use pivot to, and we'll pivot the player's character to the C frame of that world part. And now once we teleport the player to that new world, what we then want to do is say world boost update world, and then we want to pass through the world so that we visually update their GUI. Now, this is also handled on the server side, and from the server, we will also communicate this to the client as well. But the thing is that the loop is only ran on the server side every 5 seconds. You most likely could run that loop more frequently, probably even every single second without really seeing any noticeable performance impacts. But at the same time, I don't think it's really necessary or that detrimental to run that loop more frequently than every 5 seconds. So to sort of mask that delay, we're going to go ahead and update the player's GUI as if that boost is updated instantly, as it should. But again, since our loop runs every 5 seconds, it might take between 0 to 5 seconds for that to actually update on the server side and for the player to actually begin receiving the boost to their clicks. Anyways, now that we've done that, we are done with that function, and we're going to go ahead and create the next one. This function is going to be called create prompt. Its first parameter is going to be the world, which is going to be a string, and the second is going to be a part, which is of course going to be a part. Now, we're going to go ahead and create our prompt. So we're going to say instance.new, and we're going to go ahead and create a proximity prompt. We'll then go ahead and parent this prompt to the part. We'll then set the action text of it to say something like teleport to, and then we'll display the world. Then we want to listen for it to be triggered. Now, if this is triggered, we want to check if the player has the world unlocked. So we'll create a variable called isWorldUnlocked, which is going to be equal to the world's config that does player own requirement. We'll pass through the state manager.getData, as well as the world that the player is going to want to travel to. Now, if the world is unlocked, then we can simply go ahead and call teleport world and then go ahead and teleport them to that world. But if they do not have that world unlocked, then we need to go ahead and get the required island so that we can display a notification to the player telling them that they need to unlock that island first. And how can we do that? Well, we can use the world's config. Inside of the config table, we'll index that with a specific world, and then we'll get the required island property from that specific world. Then we can go ahead and create a new notification, which is going to say something like you must unlock then the required island name first, exclamation mark. So that'll inform the player that they do not have this world unlocked and they first must unlock a specific island before they can travel to that world. And that's all that we actually have to do inside of this function. Now let's go ahead and call that function. And in order to call this function, we actually need to create a prompt for every single world portal. So we're going to go ahead and loop through all the worlds inside of the world's config. So we're going to say for world, info in world's config .config do, and then we need to get that button part, which is inside of the portal model. Now, how can we access this? Well, we can say Workspace, then go inside of the world portals folder, then we'll go inside of the specific world model, and we just need to get the primary part of that model. Or we could look for a part inside of it called button, but I already set the primary part of the model to that, so either of those things work. Now, if we are able to find that button, then what we're going to do is go ahead and call create prompt. We'll pass through the world, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the button as well. And that's actually all that we have to do inside of here as well. So we can go ahead and close out of that. Now, there's one last thing that we need to do, and that is updating how we calculate the player stats to incorporate the world boost into their stats. In order to do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, we'll go inside of the utils folder and open up the stats module script. Of course, inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and get the world's config. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Then we'll go inside of our click multiplier function all the way towards the bottom. We'll go ahead and create another variable inside of here, which is going to be called world multiplier. And then we'll use the world's config, then the get world boost function, and we'll pass through the current world that the player is inside of from their player data. And then we'll go ahead and add the world multiplier into their multiplier, just like that. So now, with all that being said, we can go ahead, hop into our game, and test this out. So once we hop into our game, we can see the GUI at the top says world boost 0%, and that is because we are currently in the spawn world, and it should be 0%. So that is correct. Now, let's go up to our portal, and we can see that when we get close to the portal, it says teleport to Atlantis. We hit the E button, and then when we do that, it says that you must unlock the volcano first, which is true. So let's go ahead and unlock the volcano. But first, of course, we have to unlock all these other islands. So buy now, buy now, and buy now. And now let's go ahead and try to use the Atlantis portal. So we're going to go ahead and try to use it. And when we use it, we are teleported over to our new world. Of course, it might be a little bit hard to kind of tell because the worlds look the exact same and pretty much are the exact same. But if we look at the top now, it says world boost is 100%. And now each time we click, we actually get +5. Let's go ahead and reset so that we spawn back in the spawn world. And now we can see that when we're in the spawn world, we're only getting +4 clicks and it displays world boost is 0%. Let's go ahead and use this portal one more time. And then instead of actually resetting this time, we can just go back up to here, teleport back to spawn, and now we're back at the spawn island. In addition to that, let's go ahead and teleport back to this world. Then we'll go ahead and buy some of these islands. So let's go ahead and buy that zone, that island, and we'll buy, and well, we can't actually afford that one, but that's fine. Let's go ahead and travel to this island. Now, when we travel up to here, we can see that everything is as usual. Let's go ahead and travel back to the second world, and here we are. So that is all working perfectly. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy the episode, make sure you smash the like button. Also, go down below in the description and visit the Patreon if you want to get access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.